On a freezing winter night in Colorado, 72-year-old Ashley Smith stood barefoot on the porch of the home she had built with her own hands while her son closed the door in her face. No suitcase, no warning, no goodbye, just silence and betrayal. As the wind cut through her thin coat, Ashley realized something far worse than losing her home. She had been erased from her own family. By morning she would be gone, not found in town, not found on the roads. Because Ashley didn't just disappear. She chose to vanish into the mountains, into a place no one would ever think to look. If you've ever been abandoned by the ones you trusted most, stay with this story. Long before that night on the porch, Ashley Smith had been the kind of woman people described in quiet admiration, steady, dependable, the one who held everything together when life began to fall apart. She hadn't always been alone. There had been a time when laughter filled the house on Maplewood Drive, when the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and roasted chicken, when her husband, Robert Smith, would come home with tired eyes but a soft smile setting his keys down as their 2 children ran to greet him. Back then, Ashley believed in something simple, that if you gave your life to your family, they would never let you fall. And for a long time, she was right. But life rarely breaks all at once. It erodes slowly, quietly, in ways you don't notice until there's nothing left. Robert's death had been the first fracture, a sudden heart attack, no warning, no time for goodbyes. Ashley remembered the hospital hallway like a dream. She could never wake from the sterile smell, the doctor's carefully chosen words, the moment her world split into before and after. She didn't cry in front of her children. Michael had been 23, then old enough to understand loss, but not strong enough to carry it. Jennifer was just 19, angry at the world for taking her father too soon. Ashley became everything at once: mother, father, provider, protector. She worked longer hours at the local library, took on extra shifts cataloging archives late into the night. She sold Robert's tools, then her jewelry, then eventually even the old pickup truck they had once shared. Every sacrifice felt justified because her children needed her, because love, she believed, meant giving until there was nothing left to give. At first, Michael appreciated it. He told himself he did. But appreciation has a way of mutating when it lingers too long without balance. To Michael, the house became more than a home. It became an asset. Something tangible, something that could be leveraged, sold, turned into opportunity. He didn't say it out loud, not at first. But the thought settled into his mind and refused to leave. Why should everything his mother had built just sit there? Jennifer's distance was different. Where Michael leaned toward entitlement, Jennifer leaned toward absence. She remembered her mother differently, not as a hero, but as someone who was always tired, always working, always saying not now when Jennifer needed her most. In Jennifer's mind, Ashley hadn't abandoned her physically, but emotionally she had disappeared long before that winter night, and resentment once rooted grows quietly. Years passed. Michael moved into real estate, learning how to read markets, how to negotiate deals, how to see houses not as homes but as numbers. Jennifer drifted from job to job, relationship to relationship, never quite settling, never quite satisfied. Ashley stayed the same. She kept the house. She kept the routines. She kept believing that one day things would feel like they used to. But what she didn't see, what she couldn't see, was how far her children had already drifted from her. The conversations became shorter. The visits became rare. The warmth faded. Still, she held on, because hope, like love, doesn't die easily. It was Michael who brought up the idea first. Not directly, not honestly. He framed it as a concern. "You shouldn't be living alone at your age," he told her one afternoon, standing in the doorway with practiced ease. "The house is too big, too much work." Ashley smiled gently. "This house isn't work," she said. "It's home." Michael nodded, but inside he disagreed. To him, it was wasted value. Jennifer joined the conversation later, reinforcing the idea, but from a different angle. "You deserve something easier, Mom," she said. "Somewhere smaller, somewhere modern." Ashley hesitated, not because she believed them, but because she wanted to believe they cared. That hesitation was all they needed. The plan unfolded quietly. Documents prepared, signatures required, explanations simplified. Michael handled most of it, his experience making the process smooth, almost invisible. Jennifer played her part too, offering reassurance, softening doubts, keeping Ashley from asking too many questions. And Ashley trusted them, because they were her children, because she had raised them, because she believed deep down that no matter how distant they had become, they would never truly hurt her. The day everything changed didn't feel dramatic at first. It felt ordinary. Ashley had been in the kitchen washing dishes when Michael walked in with a folder in his hands. His expression was different, tighter, more controlled. Jennifer stood behind him, arms crossed, eyes avoiding her mother's. "Ashley," Michael said, using her name, not Mom. That was the first sign, a small one. But something in Ashley's chest tightened. "We need to talk." The words hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Ashley dried her hands, slowly turning to face them. "What is it?" Michael placed the folder on the table. "It's about the house." Her heart skipped. "The house, it's been sold." Silence, not the kind that passes quickly, but the kind that stretches heavy and suffocating. Ashley blinked. "I don't understand." Jennifer finally spoke, but her voice lacked conviction. "You signed the papers, Mom." Ashley's mind raced. Papers. What papers? Then it hit her, the forms Michael had asked her to sign weeks ago. Something about refinancing. Something about protection. You said her voice trembled. You said it was just paperwork. Michael exhaled sharply, impatience breaking through. "It was paperwork, legal paperwork. You agreed to it." "No," Ashley whispered. "No, I didn't agree to sell my home." But even as she said it, doubt crept in. Had she misunderstood? Had she trusted too easily? Michael's tone hardened. "It's done, Ashley. The deal is final. The new owners take possession tomorrow. Tomorrow." The word shattered something inside her. "That's not possible," she said, shaking her head. "I live here. Not anymore." 3 words. Cold, final, unforgiving. Jennifer looked away. Michael didn't. "You'll have to leave tonight." The room tilted. Ashley reached for the edge of the table to steady herself. "Tonight," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "We've arranged everything," Michael continued. "There's a motel. I don't want a motel," she said, her voice breaking for the first time. "I want my home." But her home was no longer hers. And somewhere deep inside, Ashley realized something far more painful than losing a house. She had lost her children, not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small choices that had led them here. The silence that followed was unbearable, not filled with anger, not filled with shouting, but with something worse: indifference. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably. Michael checked his watch. And Ashley? Ashley stood there in the kitchen. She had built a life in realizing that everything she had believed about love, sacrifice, and family had just been erased. The first night nearly killed her. Not from the cold alone, though it bit through Ashley Smith's thin coat like a blade, but from the silence. A silence so vast, so complete, it felt as if the world itself had forgotten how to speak. She had walked for hours after leaving the porch of her former home. At first, she didn't know where she was going. Her feet moved on instinct, carrying her past the edge of town, past the last flickering streetlight, into the dark stretch of wilderness that most people only ever saw from a distance. The mountains of Colorado rose like shadows against the sky. Ashley had never been afraid of them before, but that night, they felt like something else entirely. Unforgiving, endless, hungry, She stumbled more than once, her breath shallow, her body already weakened by shock and exhaustion. The small bag she carried, filled with little more than a change of clothes and a half-empty bottle of water, felt heavier with every step. At some point she realized she couldn't go back. Not because the distance was too far, but because something inside her had already closed that door. The life she had known was gone. And whatever came next, however uncertain, however dangerous, was all she had left. It was pure accident that she found the cave. Or at least that's what it felt like at the time. Her foot slipped on a patch of loose gravel, sending her tumbling down a short incline. She cried out, the sound swallowed instantly by the vastness around her. When she stopped, her hand scraped and her knees bruised. She lay there for a moment, staring up at the sky. Then she saw it. A dark opening in this rock face, partially hidden by overgrown brush. At first she thought it was just a shadow. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized it went deeper. Much deeper. Ashley pushed herself up slowly, wincing as pain shot through her legs. Every instinct told her to stay away, to find shelter somewhere more familiar, more open. But there was nothing else. No cabins, no roads, no signs of life, just the cold, and the growing realization that if she didn't find cover soon, she wouldn't survive the night. So she made a choice. The kind of choice people only make when there are no good options left. She stepped inside. The air changed immediately. Colder, yes, but still, protected from the wind. The darkness wrapped around her like a heavy curtain, broken only by the faint light from the entrance behind her. The ground was uneven, scattered with rocks and dust, but it was dry, safe, in a strange, uncertain way. Ashley moved a few steps deeper, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello," she called out instinctively. Her voice echoed back at her, distorted, unfamiliar. There was no answer. Of course there wasn't. She was alone. For the first time, truly alone. The realization settled over her slowly, like a weight pressing down on her chest. No home, no family, no one looking for her. The thought should have broken her. And for a moment, it almost did. Ashley sank to the ground, pulling her coat tighter around herself as her body began to shake, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something raw and overwhelming. Tears came without warning. Not loud, not dramatic. Just quiet, steady grief. "I gave you everything," she whispered into the darkness. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. Or maybe she was. Michael, Jennifer, herself. "I gave you everything." And it still wasn't enough. Her voice cracked, the echo carrying her words deeper into the cave, as if the earth itself were listening. For a long time she sat there, lost in the ache of it all. The betrayal, the confusion, the unbearable emptiness. But grief, like everything else, cannot burn forever. Eventually it fades, leaving behind something else. Something quieter. Something harder. Ashley wiped her face with trembling hands. Crying wouldn't keep her warm. Crying wouldn't keep her alive. And whether she liked it or not, survival was now her only choice. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. It began with small things, practical things. She took stock of what she had. 1 bottle of water, a few crackers at the bottom of her bag, a thin blanket. It wasn't enough. Not even close. But it was something. She moved further into the cave, careful, with each step her hands brushing against the rough stone walls for balance. The deeper she went, the darker it became, but also quieter, more insulated from the biting wind outside. Eventually she found a spot that felt right. A slight indentation in the rock, partially shielded from drafts. It would have to do. Ashley sat down again, this time with purpose. She arranged the blanket beneath her, trying to create some barrier between her body and the cold ground. She took a small sip of water, forcing herself to ration it. Every action felt deliberate, measured, necessary. Time passed slowly, or maybe it passed quickly, she couldn't tell. Without light, without sound, without anything to mark the hours, the world lost its structure. There was only darkness and her thoughts. They came in waves, memories of Robert's laughter, of Michael as a boy running through the yard, of Jennifer sitting at the kitchen table, swinging her legs, asking questions about everything. Those memories hurt more than the cold, because they reminded her of what had been lost. Not just a house, not just a life, but a connection she had believed was unbreakable. At some point, Ashley realized she was talking out loud. At first, it startled her. Then, it comforted her. "Well," she said softly, her voice echoing faintly around her. "This isn't exactly how I imagined things turning out." The absurdity of it, of speaking into an empty cave, almost made her laugh. Almost. But the sound that came out was something else. Something quieter. Something steadier. "You're still here," she continued as if reminding herself. "That has to count for something." It was a small thought, a fragile one, but it was enough, because as long as she was still here, the story wasn't over. The cold pressed in harder as the night deepened. Her body ached, her fingers went numb. Sleep came in brief, restless moments, never deep, never safe. Every sound, every shift of air, every distant drip of water pulled her back to alertness. Fear lingered at the edges of her mind. What if something was out there? What if the cave wasn't empty? What if she didn't wake up? But beneath the fear, something else began to grow. A quiet, stubborn resolve. Ashley didn't have the words for it yet, didn't fully understand it. But it was there. In the way she forced herself to stay awake when her body wanted to give in, in the way she rationed her water instead of drinking it all at once, in the way she kept breathing, even when every breath felt heavy. She wasn't just surviving. She was choosing to survive, over and over again. The night stretched on, endless, unforgiving. But eventually, it began to change. At first, it was subtle, a faint shift in the air, a barely noticeable light creeping into the cave's entrance. Dawn. Ashley opened her eyes, slowly, her body stiff, her muscles aching. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The house, the door closing, the mountains, the cave, her new reality. She pushed herself up, wincing as pain shot through her legs. Every movement felt heavier than it should, but she moved anyway. Step by step, she made her way toward the entrance. The light grew stronger with each step, illuminating the rough stone walls, revealing details she hadn't seen in the darkness. The cave wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was deeper, wider, more complex. And as Ashley stepped into the morning light, shielding her eyes against the brightness, she realized something unexpected. She was still alive, not just breathing, alive. The world outside hadn't changed. The mountain still stood. The sky still stretched endlessly above. But something inside her had. The woman who had been forced out of her home the night before was not the same woman standing at the entrance of that cave. That woman had been broken, lost, defined by what had been taken from her. But this woman had made it through the night. And somewhere deep within the silence of that cave, something new had begun. Not hope, not yet, but something stronger, something quieter, something that didn't depend on anyone else. A beginning. By the third day, Ashley Smith understood one thing with unsettling clarity. Survival was not a temporary state. It was her life now. There would be no sudden rescue, no miraculous return to the warmth of her old kitchen, no apology waiting at the end of the mountain trail. The world she had known had ended the moment that door closed behind her. And this cave, this cold, silent hollow carved into stone, was what remained. At first, she moved through her days with simple intentions: find water, conserve energy, endure. But as her body slowly adjusted to the rhythm of isolation, her mind began to seek something more: understanding, purpose, anything that could make sense of the emptiness. It started with a sound, a faint, irregular drip, echoing from deeper within the cave. At first, Ashley ignored it. Sounds in the cave came and went, shifting air, settling rock, distant echoes that meant nothing. But this one persisted. Drip. Pause. Drip. It was steady, intentional almost. And more importantly, it suggested water. Ashley followed the sound cautiously, her hand gliding along the rough stone wall as she moved deeper into the cave than she had dared before. The light from the entrance faded quickly behind her, swallowed by darkness. Her breath slowed, her senses sharpened. Every step felt like crossing into something unknown. The air grew cooler, heavier, the silence thicker. And then she saw it. A narrow channel carved naturally into the rock, where water trickled slowly from above, collecting in a shallow basin below. Ashley dropped to her knees, relief washing over her so suddenly it made her dizzy. Water. Clean, clear, real. She cupped her hands and drank carefully at first, then with growing urgency, the cold liquid grounding her, pulling her back into her body. For the first time since entering the cave, she felt something close to stability. This wasn't just a place to hide. It could be a place to live. The realization shifted something in her. If she could survive here, then maybe she could endure more than she had believed. But survival alone was not what drew her deeper into the cave that day. It was curiosity. As Ashley lingered near the water source, catching her breath, she noticed something unusual. Marks. Faint lines etched into the stone wall nearby. At first she thought they were natural, random scratches formed by time and erosion. But as she leaned closer, her fingers tracing the grooves, she felt a pattern. Deliberate. Repetitive. Human. Her heart began to beat faster. Someone had been here before. Not recently, the carvings were worn, softened by time, but they were unmistakable. Symbols, shapes, rough attempts at letters, perhaps. Ashley stepped back slowly, her mind racing. This cave wasn't untouched. It had a history, and for reasons she couldn't fully explain, that thought both unsettled and comforted her. She wasn't the first person to seek refuge here. She wasn't alone. Not entirely. Driven by a mixture of caution and curiosity, Ashley decided to explore further. The passage narrowed as she moved deeper, forcing her to turn sideways at times, her shoulders brushing against cold stone. The darkness thickened around her, but she pressed on, guided by instinct more than sight. Every step felt like a question, and every shadow like a possible answer. Then, unexpectedly, the space opened. Ashley blinked her eyes, adjusting to the faint light filtering in from a small crack high above. What she saw made her breath catch. A chamber, hidden deep within the cave. The walls were smoother here, the ground more even, as if shaped not by nature alone, but by intention, and scattered across the space were objects, old, dust-covered, but unmistakably placed. Ashley approached slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. There was a wooden box, its surface cracked with age, a rusted lantern, fragments of cloth faded beyond recognition, and in the corner, a stack of journals. Her hands trembled as she reached for them. The leather covers were worn, brittle at the edges, but intact. She opened one carefully, afraid it might fall apart beneath her touch. Inside, the pages were filled with handwriting. Faded, yes, but legible. Ashley's breath hitched. These weren't just objects. They were stories, lives, preserved in ink. She sat down slowly, the journal resting in her lap, and began to read. The words pulled her in immediately. A name appeared on the first page: Thomas Whitaker. The year 1873. A settler. A man who had come to these mountains with his family, searching for a new beginning. Ashley turned the pages, her fingers moving faster as the story unfolded. They had struggled at first, harsh winter's limited supplies isolation that pressed in on them just as it now pressed in on her. But they had endured, built something, believed in something, until something went wrong. The tone of the writing shifted. Hope gave way to tension, tension to fear. There were mentions of illness, of scarcity, of decisions that had to be made, decisions no one should ever have to face. Ashley's chest tightened as she read. This wasn't just a story of survival. It was a story of loss, of a family pushed to the edge. And yet they had continued writing, continued recording their days, their thoughts, their fears, as if even in the face of everything they refused to disappear without leaving something behind. Ashley closed the journal slowly, her mind heavy with what she had read. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Different time, different circumstances. But the same core truth. They had been isolated, abandoned by the world, forced to survive in a place no one else understood. Just like her. For a long moment, Ashley sat in silence, the weight of that realization settling over her. She wasn't just hiding in this cave. She was stepping into a story that had begun long before her. A story of resilience, of endurance, of people who had faced the unimaginable and still chosen to go on. Her eyes moved around the chamber again, seeing it differently now. Not as a random collection of forgotten things, but as evidence, proof that life could exist here, that meaning could be found here, and slowly, something shifted inside her. The pain was still there, the betrayal, the grief. But alongside it, something else began to take shape. Connection. Not to her children, not to the life she had lost, but to something deeper. Something that didn't depend on others. Ashley reached for another journal, opening it with more confidence this time. She read until the light faded, until the words blurred, until exhaustion forced her to stop. And when she finally closed her eyes that night, lying on the cold stone floor of the cave, something was different. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was learning, understanding, becoming. Because for the first time since that night on the porch, Ashley Smith didn't feel completely erased. She felt remembered. The journals changed everything. Before she found them, Ashley Smith had been living from moment to moment, measuring her days in sips of water, in fragments of sleep, in the quiet battle between fear and endurance. Survival had been enough. Now, it wasn't. Now there was something else. Something that pulled her forward each morning, even when her body ached and her bones felt heavier than the stones surrounding her. Purpose. It didn't arrive all at once. It grew slowly, almost unnoticed at first, like a small flame in a place that had only known darkness. Ashley began returning to the hidden chamber every day. At first, it was simply to read. She would sit cross-legged on the cold ground, the journals spread carefully in front of her, tracing each line with patient attention. The handwriting varied from entry to entry. Thomas Whitaker's firm strokes his wife. Eleanor's softer script, even shorter passages that seemed to belong to a child, a family, a real family. Their voices reached across time, echoing in the stillness of the cave, weaving themselves into Ashley's thoughts. She began to know them. Not just their names, but their fears, their hopes, their small moments of joy in a place that offered so little of it. There were entries about collecting firewood before the first snowfall, about rationing food, about laughter, brief, fragile, but real, over a shared memory of a home far away. And then gradually the tone shifted again. Hardship deepened, illness spread. The entries became shorter, more urgent, more desperate. Ashley found herself holding her breath as she read, her chest tightening with each page. She knew how it felt to lose control, to watch something you loved slip away while you stood powerless. She had lived it. not in the same way, but close enough. One afternoon, after finishing another journal, Ashley sat in silence for a long time. The cave felt different now. Not just a place of shelter, but a place of memory, a place where lives had unfolded, where choices had been made, where stories had been left behind. And suddenly the thought came to her. Clear, unavoidable. If she left, if she died here, these stories would vanish. Just like that. Erased. Just as she had been erased. The idea settled deep inside her, stirring something she hadn't felt in a long time. Responsibility. Ashley looked around the chamber again, her gaze lingering on the scattered objects, the fragile pages of the journals, the traces of a family that had once fought to survive in the same darkness she now called home. They shouldn't be forgotten, she said quietly. Her voice echoed back to her softer this time, as if the cave itself agreed. That was the moment everything changed. Not because her situation improved, not because the cave became warmer or safer or easier to live in, but because Ashley's role within it shifted. She was no longer just a woman hiding from the world. She became a witness, a keeper, a guardian of something that mattered. The next morning she began her work. It started with the simplest of tasks, organization. Carefully, gently, she gathered the journals, stacking them in order based on dates she could decipher. She cleared a space in the chamber, brushing away dust and loose debris to create a small, stable area where the materials could be kept safe. Her movements were so deliberate. Every action carried weight. These weren't just objects. They were pieces of lives. And she treated them that way. She began to notice details she had overlooked before. Small symbols carved into the edges of some pages, maps sketched in the margins, loose scraps of paper tucked between entries, notes perhaps, or unfinished thoughts. Each discovery felt like uncovering a piece of a puzzle, a story waiting to be fully understood. But Ashley didn't stop there. As the days passed, she did something she never expected. She started writing. At first it felt strange, unnecessary even. Who would read it? Who would care? But the question didn't stop her. Because writing wasn't just about being read. It was about being remembered. Ashley found a few blank pages within the journals, unused sections preserved by time. With a piece of charcoal she had fashioned from burned wood near the cave's entrance, she began to record her own thoughts, her own story. The first entry was hesitant. The words came slowly, unevenly, as if she were relearning how to speak. "My name is Ashley Smith," she wrote. "I was brought here by loss." She paused, staring at the words. They felt too simple, too small to contain everything that had happened. But they were a beginning, and beginnings were enough. Each day she added more. She wrote about the night she left her home, about the cold, about the silence, about the moment she realized no one was coming to find her, but she also wrote about the cave, about the water she discovered, about the journals, about the strange comfort she found in knowing she wasn't the first to survive here. Her writing became a bridge connecting her to the past, anchoring her in the present. And slowly something remarkable began to happen. The pain didn't disappear, but it changed. It became structured, contained. Something she could examine rather than something that consumed her entirely. Ashley was no longer just living through her suffering. She was understanding it, transforming it. Outside the cave, the world moved on. Seasons shifted. Snow gave way to early signs of spring, though Ashley only glimpsed these changes from the cave's entrance. She learned to read the air to sense the passage of time through subtle differences in light and temperature. Back in town, her absence faded into memory. At first, there had been concern. A few searches, quiet conversations, but without answers, without a body, without closure, people moved on. They always do. Michael and Jennifer adapted quickly. Too quickly. Their lives continued, shaped now by the wealth gained from the sale of the house. New furniture, new routines, new versions of themselves. But beneath the surface, something lingered. Michael buried it under logic. It was legal, he told himself. She agreed. It was her choice. But late at night when the house was quiet, doubt crept in. Not loud, not overwhelming, just enough to disturb his sleep. Jennifer's guilt was different, less structured, more emotional. She avoided thinking about her mother. Altogether avoided places, memories, anything that might remind her of what had happened. But avoidance is not the same as peace. And somewhere deep inside, a question remained unanswered. Where did she go, back in the cave? Ashley didn't know any of this. She didn't know how her absence was interpreted, didn't know whether anyone still thought about her. And in time, she stopped wondering, because her life had narrowed to something both smaller and more meaningful. Each day had purpose, each action mattered. She gathered small branches near the cave's entrance, learning how to create controlled fires for warmth without filling the cave with smoke. She experimented with ways to store water. She observed the patterns of light, mapping out the safest times to move deeper into the cave or venture closer to the outside. She became capable. Not in the way she once had been, not in the comfort of a home surrounded by familiar routines, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. She was learning how to exist without anything she once believed she needed. And that realization changed everything, because for the first time in her life, Ashley Smith was not defined by what she gave to others. She was defined by what she built for herself. In the quiet, in the darkness, in the place the world had forgotten, she was becoming someone new. Not a victim, not a memory, but something stronger, something that could not be erased. Time in the cave had no calendar. Ashley Smith did not count days the way she once had. No mornings marked by coffee, no evenings softened by television light. Instead, she learned to measure life through quieter rhythms, the angle of sunlight at the cave's mouth, the shifting chill in the air, the slow wearing down of charcoal in her hands as she wrote. Weeks blurred into months, months dissolved into years. And while Ashley adapted to her new existence, becoming stronger, steadier, almost inseparable from the cave itself, the world beyond the mountains did what it always does. It moved on. In the town she once called home, her absence had first been a disruption. Neighbors had noticed when the house on Maplewood Drive emptied too quickly. There were questions, quiet at first, then louder. A few people asked Michael, a few asked Jennifer. Their answers were simple. She left. She wanted something different. She needed space. There was no drama in their version, no urgency, no visible guilt. And without evidence to contradict them, the town accepted it, because people prefer explanations that allow them to return to their routines. At first, there had been a brief attempt to look for her. A volunteer search team combed nearby trails. Flyers were printed. Ashley's face captured in an old photograph, her smile frozen in a time that no longer existed. Missing. That word carried weight, but not for long. Days passed, then weeks. No signs, no sightings, no answers. And gradually the urgency faded. The flyers peeled away from bulletin boards, their edges curling with time and weather. Conversations about her became shorter, less frequent, until they disappeared altogether. Ashley Smith became a memory. And then, eventually, not even that. Michael Smith thrived in the silence. The sale of the house had brought more than just money, it had opened doors. His real estate career advanced quickly, fueled by a confidence that bordered on ruthlessness. He told himself he had done what was necessary. It was just business, he would say, when the thought of his mother surfaced unexpectedly. She couldn't manage it anymore. I helped her in a way. The justification became a habit. Repeated often enough, it began to feel like truth. He bought a larger home on the edge of town, modern, polished, filled with everything Ashley had never cared for. Clean lines, expensive furniture, a space designed to impress, but not to comfort. At night, the house felt too quiet, too empty. Michael ignored that feeling. He worked longer hours, took on more deals, filled his life with movement, with noise, with anything that kept him from sitting still long enough to think. Jennifer's life unfolded differently. Where Michael built, Jennifer drifted. She moved into a small apartment downtown, cycling through jobs that never quite fit. Relationships came and went, each one leaving her more restless than the last. She avoided her brother when she could, avoided conversations about the past, avoided anything that might force her to look directly at what had happened. But avoidance is not absence, and in quiet moments late at night when the city noise softened, her thoughts turned inward. She remembered her mother's voice, her hands, the way she used to hum while cooking even when she was exhausted. Memories she had pushed aside began to resurface. Not all at once, but enough to unsettle her. Jennifer told herself she had been justified, that her mother had been distant, that things had been complicated. But deep down beneath the layers of explanation, something remained unresolved. A question she could not answer. Why did it feel so wrong? Meanwhile, the town settled into a new normal. New families moved into old homes. New stories replaced old ones. The mountains remained unchanged, looming in the distance, as they always had silent witnesses to everything that came and went. And somewhere within those mountains, hidden from sight, Ashley lived on, unseen, unremembered. But not undone. It was nearly 4 years after her disappearance that someone finally began to ask questions again. His name was Ethan Brooks. 28 years old, recently returned to town after studying journalism in Denver. He had taken a position at the local paper, not because it was prestigious, but because it offered something he valued more: space, freedom, the chance to tell stories that mattered. At first, Ethan focused on the usual assignments, community events, small business features, local politics, the kind of stories that filled pages but rarely lingered in people's minds. But he noticed something. A pattern, or rather, an absence. One afternoon, while sorting through archived records in the paper's small, cluttered office, he came across a file labeled simply Smith Ashley, Missing Person. He opened it out of curiosity. Inside were the old flyers, a brief report, notes from the initial search effort. It wasn't much, but something about it felt incomplete. Ethan leaned back in his chair, reading through the details again. 72 years old. Last seen at her home. No confirmed sightings. Case closed due to lack of evidence. He frowned. Case closed, he murmured to himself. There was no resolution, no body, no explanation, just silence. And silence in Ethan's experience often meant something had been overlooked. He began asking questions, casually at first. He spoke to neighbors, to people who had lived near Ashley's old home. Most remembered her vaguely, a quiet woman, kind, kept to herself. But when he asked about her disappearance, the answers were always the same. She left. That's what her son said. Didn't want to stay here anymore. Ethan nodded, but something didn't sit right. People don't just vanish without a trace, not without leaving something behind. So he dug deeper. He requested access to property records, looked into the sale of the house, and that's when he noticed it. The timeline. The house had been sold almost immediately after Ashley's disappearance. Too quickly. Suspiciously quickly. Ethan's interest sharpened. He visited Michael. The meeting was polite, controlled. Michael answered questions with practiced ease, his tone calm, his explanations consistent. She wanted to move on, he said. We helped her do that. Do you know where she went? Ethan asked. Michael shook his head. No, she didn't say. There was no hesitation in his voice, no visible discomfort. But Ethan had learned to listen beyond words, and something just beneath the surface felt off. Jennifer was different. When Ethan approached her, she was less composed. more guarded, her answers shorter, her eyes avoiding his. "I don't want to talk about it," she said at one point, her voice tight. "It's in the past." But the past, Ethan knew, doesn't stay buried unless someone makes sure of it. And the more resistance he encountered, the more certain he became. There was a story here. Not just about a missing woman, but about something deeper. Something hidden. So Ethan made a decision. If the answers weren't in town, he would look where no one else had. The mountains. The place where Ashley Smith had last been seen. The place everyone assumed had swallowed her whole. He prepared carefully, packed supplies, mapped out trails, and one crisp morning, under a pale blue sky, Ethan Brooks set out alone. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, didn't expect to find anything definitive, but he trusted his instincts. And those instincts told him one thing. Clearly, Ashley Smith's story wasn't over. It had simply been waiting for someone willing to look deeper. Ethan Brooks had hiked these mountains before. As a teenager, he had come here with friends careless, loud convinced the world was something to be conquered. Back then, the trails had felt familiar, almost predictable. A place for escape, not for answers. But now, everything felt different. The mountains weren't just landscape anymore. They were possibility. And somewhere within them, a question waited to be answered. Ashley Smith. Ethan repeated the name in his mind as he followed the narrow trail upward, his boots crunching softly against gravel and frozen patches of earth. The air was crisp, thin enough to remind him with every breath that he was far from the comfort of town. He had prepared carefully. Backpack stocked with water food, a flashlight, a notebook. Enough for a day, maybe two. He didn't expect to need more, because logically, there was nothing to find. That's what everyone believed. But logic had never satisfied him. Something about the story, the timing, the inconsistencies, the silence kept pulling him forward. And now, standing on the edge of the unknown, he felt it stronger than ever. The first few hours passed without incident. Just trees, rock, wind moving through branches like distant whispers. Ethan followed no specific path after a certain point, allowing instinct to guide him. He moved slowly, scanning the terrain, looking for anything unusual. Disturbed ground signs of human presence, anything that didn't belong. At times, doubt crept in. What if he was wrong? What if this was nothing more than a story that ended years ago and he was chasing shadows? He paused at a clearing, taking a long drink from his water bottle, his gaze sweeping the horizon. The mountains stretched endlessly indifferent to his search. He exhaled. Just a little further, he muttered. Not because he was certain, but because turning back now felt like abandoning something unfinished. So he kept going. It was nearly late afternoon when he found it. Or rather, when he almost didn't. The terrain had grown steeper, more uneven. Loose rocks shifted beneath his feet. As he climbed along a narrow ridge, his focus split between maintaining balance and scanning his surroundings. That's when his foot slipped. A sudden loss of footing. A sharp intake of breath. He stumbled forward, catching himself against a jagged outcrop of stone. Pain flared briefly in his palm, but he ignored it, steadying himself. "Careful," he muttered under his breath. Then he noticed it. At first it looked like nothing. Just shadow. A darker patch against the rock face below the ridge. But something about it felt off. Ethan crouched slightly, narrowing his eyes. The shape wasn't random. It had depth, an opening, partially hidden by brush and loose stone. His pulse quickened. Slowly, carefully, he made his way down toward it, testing each step before committing his weight. The closer he got, the clearer it became. A cave. Small from the outside, easily overlooked. Exactly the kind of place someone could pass by without ever realizing it was there. Ethan stood at the entrance, his breath catching slightly. This was it. Or maybe it wasn't. But something inside him, something quiet and insistent, told him he couldn't walk away. He reached into his backpack, pulling out his flashlight. For a moment he hesitated. It was a strange feeling. Not fear exactly, but awareness. The sense that whatever waited inside might change everything. Then he stepped forward. The light from outside faded quickly as he moved deeper, replaced by the narrow beam of his flashlight cutting through darkness. The air was colder inside, still, carrying a faint, earthy scent. Ethan moved slowly, his footsteps cautious, his senses alert. "Hello?" he called out instinctively. His voice echoed back at him, distorted, unfamiliar. No answer. He continued. The cave extended further than he had expected, the passage narrowing and widening unpredictably. The beam of his flashlight revealed rough stone walls, uneven ground, nothing that immediately suggested human presence. For a moment, doubt returned. Maybe this was just another cave, another dead end. But then movement. Not in the sense of something shifting, but the unmistakable presence of something. Arranged. Ethan's light swept across the ground, catching on shapes that didn't belong to nature. A stack of objects. Organized, intentional. His breath hitched. He stepped closer, the beam of light steady now, his curiosity overriding caution. There were items here, old ones. A wooden box, fragments of cloth, and then journals. Dozens of them, carefully stacked, preserved. Ethan's mind raced. This wasn't random. This was maintained. Someone had been here. Recently. His pulse quickened. Ashley, he called out louder this time. Silence, then. A sound. Soft, subtle. Behind him. Ethan turned sharply, his flashlight swinging in a wide arc. And then he saw her. For a moment his mind refused to process what his eyes were telling him. A figure stood in the shadows, just beyond the reach of his light. Still, watching. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The beam of his flashlight settled on her face, and everything stopped. She was older than the photograph, thinner. Her hair, once neatly kept, now streaked with gray and pulled back loosely. Her clothes were worn, layered, practical, but her eyes were clear, steady, alive. Ashley Smith, not a memory, not a missing person, but a living, breathing presence standing in the silence of the cave. Ethan lowered the flashlight slightly, his voice barely more than a whisper, "Ashley." She didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, studying, measuring, as if deciding whether he belonged in her world. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "You shouldn't be here." There was no fear in her tone, no panic, only calm certainty. Ethan swallowed, trying to find his footing in a reality he hadn't truly believed he would encounter. I was looking for you," he said, his words uneven. "The town, they thought you were gone." Ashley's expression didn't change. "I am gone," she said simply. The statement hung in the air heavier than anything Ethan had expected. Gone. Not dead, not lost, but removed. By choice. By circumstance. By everything that had led her here. Ethan took a careful step forward, his movements slow, respectful. "They never found you." He continued, his voice steadier now. "They stopped looking." A flicker passed through Ashley's eyes. Not surprise, not quite. Something closer to recognition. "As they should have," she replied. Ethan hesitated. He had imagined this moment differently, if it ever happened at all. He had expected desperation, confusion, relief. But this was something else entirely. Ashley wasn't waiting to be found. She had built something here, something deliberate, something that didn't need the outside world. His gaze shifted briefly to the journals, the organized space around them. "You've been living here," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Ashley followed his gaze, then looked back at him. "Yes." The simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any explanation could. Ethan's mind struggled to catch up. Years. She had survived here. For years. Alone. Or at least he thought alone. But the cave told a different story. And so did the woman standing before him. He took another breath, grounding himself. There's a story here, he said, more to himself than to her. Not just about you. Ashley tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. No, she said softly. Not just about me. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of questions, of possibilities, of everything that had yet to be understood. Ethan realized with a clarity that sent a quiet shiver through him. He hadn't just found a missing person. He had found something far bigger, a truth that had been hidden, a story that had been waiting. And standing in front of him was the woman who had lived it, not as a victim, but as something else entirely, something stronger, something that the world had forgotten, but would not be able to ignore for much longer. Ethan Brooks didn't sleep that night. Even after he left the cave, after he retraced his steps down the mountain with careful urgency, after the trees thinned and the distant glow of town lights came into view, his mind refused to settle. Ashley Smith was alive. The sentence repeated itself over and over, refusing to feel real. Not missing, not gone, alive. And not just surviving, but preserving something extraordinary. The journals, the chamber, the story buried beneath stone. Ethan knew instinctively that what he had discovered wasn't just a personal miracle. It was something larger, something that would shake the town that had forgotten her. But he also knew something else. This story wasn't his to take. Not without her. The next morning he returned. The hike felt different now, less uncertain, more purposeful. Each step carried weight not just from the physical climb, but from the responsibility forming in his chest. When he reached the cave, he paused at the entrance. For a brief moment, doubt surfaced. What if she wasn't there? What if he had imagined it? But then he stepped inside, and she was there. Ashley stood near the chamber, her posture calm, her presence as steady as the stone around her. She looked at him as if she had known he would return. "You came back," she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded. "I had to." There was no pretense in his voice, no attempt to soften the truth. Ashley studied him for a moment, then turned, slightly gesturing toward the chamber. "Then you should understand what you found. It wasn't permission. Not yet. But it was something close." Ethan stepped forward, his gaze moving over the journals, the carefully arranged artifacts, the quiet order Ashley had built over years of isolation. "I want to tell your story," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Not just about what happened to you, but everything here, the history, the people who came before you." Ashley remained silent. Ethan continued. "They forgot you," he said, "but they shouldn't have." That made her pause. Not because she disagreed, but because the words touched something she had long since buried, forgotten. It had been true, painfully, undeniably true, but over time she had learned to live without needing to be remembered. So why did it matter now? Ashley turned her gaze toward the journals, her fingers resting lightly on one of the worn covers. "If you tell it," she said slowly, "you tell all of it." Ethan nodded immediately. "All of it. The truth," she added. "Always." She studied him again, searching for something, hesitation perhaps, or doubt. But she found neither, only sincerity, and something else. Respect. Ashley exhaled softly. For years this cave had been her world, her refuge, her truth. To bring others into it meant risking everything she had built. But it also meant something else, that the stories, hers and those of the Whitaker family, would not disappear. "They deserve to be known," she said quietly. Ethan understood. And in that moment, the decision was made. The first article was published 3 days later. Ethan didn't rush it. He wrote carefully, deliberately choosing each word with precision. He didn't begin with the cave, or the journals, or even Ashley. He began with a question. What happens when someone disappears, but never leaves? The headline spread quickly. At first, it drew curiosity, then disbelief, then something stronger. Shock. Ashley Smith was alive. The town reacted in waves. Some refused to believe it. That's not possible, they said. They searched. Others leaned in, drawn by the mystery. How could she survive out there? What really happened? But as more details emerged about the cave, about the journals, about the years she had spent preserving a forgotten piece of history, the tone began to shift. Curiosity turned into something deeper, something heavier. Guilt, regret, recognition. The woman they had once known, quiet, kind, easy to overlook, had not only survived, she had become something extraordinary. The second article went further. Ethan wrote about the Whitaker family, about their struggle, their resilience, the parallels between their story and Ashley's. And then he wrote the truth about Michael, about Jennifer, not as villains, but as people who had made choices, choices that led to consequences. The reaction was immediate. Public opinion turned sharply. Whispers filled the streets, then conversations, then open criticism. How could they do that to their own mother? She trusted them. They left her with nothing. Michael felt it first. At work, in subtle ways. Colleagues who once greeted him warmly now kept their distance. Conversations quieted when he entered a room. Clients hesitated. His reputation, carefully built, meticulously maintained, began to crack. He told himself it was temporary, that it would pass. But each day the pressure grew. Jennifer felt it differently, more personally. Strangers recognized her, not as herself, but as Ashley Smith's daughter, the daughter who had walked away. She avoided public places, ignored messages, but there was no escaping it, because the truth once revealed has a way of following you. Back in the cave, Ashley experienced none of the noise, but she felt the change. Ethan returned, often bringing updates, reading sections of his articles aloud, sharing the town's reaction. At first, Ashley listened in silence, processing, observing, not reacting. But as the days passed, something shifted. Not pride, not satisfaction, but something quieter. Validation. Not because the town now saw her differently, but because her truth had been spoken. And that mattered. More than she expected. "They're talking about you," Ethan said one afternoon, his voice carrying a mix of awe and disbelief. Not like before, not as someone who disappeared, but as someone who endured. Ashley looked toward the cave's entrance where light filtered in softly. "I didn't do it for them," she said. "I know," Ethan replied, "but it still matters." She considered that. Perhaps it did, not for her, but for what came next. The cave began to draw attention. Historians expressed interest. Local officials started asking questions. There were talks of preservation, of recognition, of turning the site into something permanent, something protected. Ashley listened to it all with quiet detachment. For years, this place had belonged only to her. Now, it was becoming something else, something shared. But not lost, never lost. Because no matter how many people came, no matter how many stories were told, she would always remember what it had been. A place of silence, of survival, of transformation. And as the truth spread beyond the mountains, beyond the town, beyond everything that had once ignored her, one thing became undeniable. Ashley Smith was no longer forgotten. She was seen, and the story that had once been buried in darkness was now impossible to ignore. By the time Michael Smith decided to go up the mountain, the town had already made up its mind about him. No official charges had been filed, no courtroom had declared him guilty of anything. But judgment, he was learning, did not require legal proof. It required truth. And truth had a way of spreading faster than any defense. He felt it in the silence of conversations that stopped when he entered a room, in the polite but distant smiles from people who once shook his hand with confidence, in the hesitation of clients who now questioned not just his professionalism, but his character. For years he had built his life on certainty, on control, on the belief that every decision could be justified, explained, turned into something reasonable. But now, those explanations felt thinner, less convincing, especially when he was alone. Because in the quiet, when there were no voices to argue with, no deals to close, no distractions to hide behind, there was only one question left. What had he really done? Jennifer didn't wait as long. Her reaction came sooner, sharper, more emotional. She had read Ethan's articles multiple times, each sentence cutting deeper than the last. Not because they exaggerated the truth, but because they didn't. They simply laid it bare. And for Jennifer, that was worse. She couldn't escape it. Every word pulled her back to moments she had tried to forget, the hesitation in her mother's voice, the confusion in her eyes, the way she had stood in that kitchen trying to understand what was happening. Jennifer had told herself she hadn't meant for it to go that far, that it had just happened. But the articles didn't allow for that kind of distance. They showed intention, choice, and consequence. One evening, unable to sit still any longer, Jennifer drove to Michael's house. He opened the door with a look that mirrored her own, tired, guarded, unsettled. "We need to talk," she said. The words felt familiar, too familiar. They sat across from each other in the living room, the silence between them heavier than anything they had shared before. "She's alive," Jennifer said, her voice trembling slightly. Michael nodded. "I know. She was out there. All this time, I know." The repetition didn't comfort her. It only made the reality sharper. Jennifer leaned forward, her hands gripping each other tightly. "We can't just ignore this." Michael exhaled, slowly, running a hand through his hair. "What do you want to do?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Jennifer met his gaze. "We go see her." The words hung in the air, final, unavoidable. Michael didn't respond immediately, because despite everything, despite the pressure, the judgment, the unraveling of the life he had built there was something he hadn't been able to face. Her, not as an idea, not as a problem to solve, but as a person, his mother. "I don't think she wants to see us," he said finally. Jennifer shook her head. "That doesn't matter." Her voice was steadier now, more certain. "We don't get to decide that." Michael looked away, because deep down, he knew she was right. The next morning they drove together. The journey was quiet. Neither of them spoke much, each lost in their own thoughts, their own memories, their own version of what had happened. The closer they got to the mountains, the heavier the air felt. Not physically, but emotionally, like something waiting. When they reached the base of the trail, Michael turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Jennifer opened the door and stepped out. The hike was harder than they expected, not just because of the terrain, but because of what it represented. Every step upward felt like moving closer to something they had avoided for too long, and neither of them knew what waited at the end. When they finally reached the cave, they stopped. The entrance looked smaller than they had imagined, quieter, almost ordinary, but nothing about it felt ordinary. "This is it," Jennifer said softly. Michael nodded. Neither of them moved, until a voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." They turned. And there she was. Ashley Smith stood just outside the cave, the morning light falling gently across her face. She looked older. Of course she did. But there was something else, something neither of them had expected. She didn't look broken. She didn't look lost. She looked steady, grounded, stronger than they remembered. Jennifer's breath caught. "Mom," The word felt unfamiliar on her tongue. Ashley's expression didn't change. She simply looked at them, taking them in, not with anger, not with shock, but with a calm that made everything else feel louder by comparison. Michael stepped forward slightly. "We came to what?" Ashley interrupted quietly. Her voice wasn't raised, but it stopped him, completely. Michael hesitated. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have the right words. Jennifer stepped in. "We came to talk," she said, "to explain." Ashley tilted her head slightly. "Explain." There was no sarcasm in her tone, only curiosity, and something else. Distance. Jennifer swallowed. "We didn't mean for it to happen like that," she said quickly. We thought you'd be okay, that you'd find somewhere else, that I would disappear," Ashley asked. The question landed softly, but its weight was undeniable. Jennifer's voice faltered. I didn't think no," Ashley said gently. "You didn't." Silence followed. Not tense, not explosive, but heavy, because in that moment there was no room left for excuses. Michael stepped forward again, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "We made a mistake," he said. The words felt small, insufficient, but they were all he had. Ashley considered them. "A mistake," she repeated. Then she nodded once. "Yes," she said, "you did." There was no anger in her voice, no accusation, and somehow that made it worse. Because anger could be argued with, defended against, but this calm acknowledgement of truth left them with nothing to hold on to. "I lost everything," Ashley continued. "My home, my place in your lives, the belief that I mattered to you." Her words were steady, measured, each one deliberate, but I didn't die. She looked around briefly, gesturing towards the cave, the mountains, the life she had built in their absence. "I found something else." Michael followed her gaze, seeing the space not as a hiding place, but as something shaped, chosen. He felt something shift inside him. Not guilt, not exactly. Something deeper. Recognition. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "We're sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "We didn't understand what we were doing." Ashley looked back at her. And for a moment, something softened. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But understanding. Of a different kind. "I know," she said. That surprised them both. Ashley stepped closer, not to close the distance, but to make something clear. "You didn't understand," she repeated. "But you chose not to understand." The distinction mattered, because one was ignorance. The other was decision. Michael lowered his gaze, because he knew exactly which one it had been. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Ashley didn't answer immediately. She looked at them, really looked at them, not as the children she had raised, but as the people they had become. And then she spoke. "Now," she said, "you live with what you've done." The words weren't harsh, but they were final. Not punishment, not revenge, just truth. Jennifer wiped at her tears. "Is there anything we can do?" she asked. Ashley considered that. For a long moment. Then she shook her head slightly. "Not for me." The answer landed harder than anything else, because it meant the distance between them couldn't be undone. Not with apologies, not with effort, not with time. But Ashley wasn't finished. "For yourselves," she added, "you can decide who you want to be next." That was all she offered. Not a path, not a promise, just a choice. The same kind of choice they had made before. Only now, they understood the weight of it. Michael nodded slowly. Jennifer looked down. And Ashley stepped back toward the cave. Not retreating, not hiding, but returning. To the life she had built. To the place where she had become something they could no longer take away. They had come looking for closure, for resolution, for something that might ease what they carried, But what they found instead was something far more difficult. Truth, unchanged, unsoftened, and impossible to escape. The mountains did not change for anyone. They remained as they had always been, quiet, immovable, untouched by the noise of human judgment. Yet for the first time in decades, people began to look at them differently, not as distant scenery, but as a place that held a story, Ashley Smith's story, and the story of those who had come before her. It began slowly. A few local officials reached out to Ethan Brooks asking for details about the cave. Historians from nearby universities expressed interest in the journals, intrigued by the possibility of an undocumented settler family whose records had somehow survived time. At first, Ashley resisted the idea of involvement. For years, the cave had been hers, her refuge, her truth, her transformation. To open it to others felt like risking something sacred. But as Ethan explained the situation, she began to see it differently. "They're not coming to take it from you," he said one afternoon, sitting near the cave entrance as sunlight stretched across the stone. "They want to preserve it, protect it, make sure it doesn't disappear." Ashley listened in silence. Disappear. The word held weight, because she understood better than anyone how easily someone could be erased. "They want to tell the story," Ethan continued. "All of it. The Whitakers. You. Everything that happened here." Ashley's gaze drifted toward the chamber where the journals rested in careful order. For years she had carried that responsibility alone, guarded it, lived it. And now, there was a chance for it to exist beyond her. Not as a memory, but as something lasting. Still, the decision wasn't simple. "This place kept me alive," she said quietly. "It gave me something when I had nothing." Ethan nodded. "And now it can do that for others?" That was what stayed with her. Not recognition, not attention, but purpose. The idea that what she had built here, what she had preserved, could mean something beyond her own survival. A few weeks later, Ashley agreed to meet with a small group of representatives. They approached the cave with a kind of reverence she hadn't expected, moving carefully, speaking softly, aware that they were stepping into something more than just a physical space. Among them was Dr. Helen Carter, a historian specializing in 19th century settlement patterns. She was the first to examine the journals. Her reaction was immediate. "These are remarkable," she said, her voice filled with quiet awe as she turned the fragile pages. "This kind of first-hand account? It's rare, incredibly rare." Ashley watched her closely, not for praise, but for understanding, and she saw it, genuine, unfiltered. "These people lived through something extraordinary," Dr. Carter continued. "And she looked up at Ashley. "You made sure their story survived." Ashley didn't respond. Not because she disagreed, but because she had never thought of it that way. She had simply done what felt necessary, what felt right. The discussions that followed were careful, deliberate. Nothing would be taken from the cave. Nothing would be removed without Ashley's consent. The site would be preserved exactly as it was, with minimal interference designed to protect rather than alter. Eventually, the decision was made. The cave would be designated a protected historical site, not just for the artifacts, not just for the journals, but for the story itself, for what it represented: resilience, endurance, the refusal to disappear. As word spread, the town responded once again. But this time the reaction was different. Not shock, not judgment, but something closer to reflection. People began to visit not the cave itself, which remained restricted, but the base of the mountain. They stood at a distance, looking up as if trying to understand something they had once overlooked. Local schools introduced lessons about the Whitaker family, about Ashley, about the idea that history is not just something that happens in textbooks, but something lived often quietly, often unnoticed. Ethan's articles evolved as well. No longer focused solely on revelation, they shifted toward meaning. What does it mean to survive? What does it mean to be forgotten and then remembered? And more importantly, what does it mean to choose who you become after everything has been taken from you? Ashley read them occasionally. Not often. She didn't need to, because the answers to those questions weren't in the articles. They were in her life. She chose not to leave the cave. That decision surprised many. Some expected her to return to town to reclaim something of her former life. But Ashley understood something they didn't, that life no longer belonged to her, not because it had been taken, but because she had moved beyond it. The cave was not a place of loss, not anymore. It was a place of creation, of meaning, of identity. "I'm not going back," she told Ethan simply when he asked. He nodded. He understood, because he had seen it, felt it. This wasn't isolation, it was choice. Instead, Ashley became something new, a guide, not in the traditional sense, but in a deeper, quieter way. She worked with the historians, helping them understand the cave, the journals, the context that only she could provide. She shared what she had learned not just about the past, but about survival, about endurance, about what it means to keep going when there is nothing left to hold on to. People listened, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Because Ashley spoke not from theory, but from experience. And that made all the difference. Over time, a small visitor center was established at the base of the mountain. Nothing elaborate, just a space where people could learn, read, reflect. The journals remained in the cave, protected, preserved, but their stories were shared. Carefully, accurately, truthfully. Ashley visited the center once, only once. She walked through the exhibits slowly, her eyes moving over the photographs, the written accounts, the way her story had been translated into something others could understand. She paused at one section, a simple line written in clear, steady print. She was forgotten, but she refused to disappear. Ashley stood there for a long moment, not smiling, not emotional, just present. Because for the first time she saw her life not as a series of losses, but as something that had become something more. She turned away quietly and left. Back to the mountain, back to the cave, back to the place where everything had changed. And as she stepped inside once more, the familiar stillness greeted her, not as emptiness, but as peace. Because this place, once a refuge, had become a legacy, not just of what had been lost, but of what had been found. And in that quiet, in that enduring silence, Ashley Smith understood something with absolute clarity. She had not just survived being forgotten. She had transformed it into something that would never be forgotten again. The ceremony was never supposed to be large. Ashley had made that clear from the beginning. No crowds, no spectacle, no attempt to turn her life into something performative. But stories, real stories, have a way of growing beyond intention. And on that quiet autumn morning, more people gathered at the base of the mountain than anyone had expected. Not out of curiosity, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. Respect. The air was crisp, touched by the early signs of winter. Leaves, half golden and half faded, clung to the trees as if reluctant to let go. The mountain stood behind them, unchanged, as always silent, steady, holding everything that words could not fully capture. Ashley Smith stood apart from the crowd, not hidden, not distant, just slightly removed. She wore a simple coat, the same one she had worn for years, layered over clothes shaped more by function than appearance. Her hair, streaked with gray, was pulled back loosely. Time had marked her, yes, but it had not diminished her. If anything, it had refined her. There was no trace of the woman who had stood barefoot on a porch, abandoned and uncertain years ago. That version of her had not disappeared. It had transformed. Ethan Brooks stood nearby, speaking quietly with one of the organizers. When he noticed Ashley, he approached, his expression softening. "They're ready," he said. Ashley nodded. She looked out at the gathering faces from the town she had once known, and many she didn't recognize at all. People of different ages, different lives, all drawn here by something they could not fully explain. Her story, or perhaps what her story represented. She doesn't have to speak if she doesn't want to, Ethan added gently. Ashley considered that. For years, silence had been her language, her protection, her space to heal. But now, silence no longer felt necessary. I will, she said simply. The ceremony began without grandeur. A few words from local officials. A brief acknowledgement from the historians who had helped preserve the site. Nothing excessive, nothing that overshadowed what truly mattered. Then they invited her forward. Ashley walked slowly to the front, each step deliberate, grounded. The crowd quieted instinctively, not out of formality, but because something about her presence demanded it. She stood for a moment without speaking, her gaze moving across the faces before her. Some looked at her with admiration, some with regret, some with something harder to define. She didn't judge them, because she understood something they were still learning, that people are not defined by a single moment, but by what they choose after it. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, unforced. I didn't expect to be here, she began. A small truth, but a powerful one. Not like this. A faint ripple of understanding moved through the crowd. Ashley continued, There was a time when I believed my life had ended. Not because I had died, but because everything that gave it meaning had been taken from me. Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Because they were real, I lost my home. I lost my place in my family. I lost the belief that I mattered to the people I had given everything to. Silence deepened, not uncomfortable, but attentive. I thought that was the end of my story. She paused, her gaze drifting briefly toward the mountains behind her. But it wasn't. The shift in her tone was subtle, but unmistakable, because something happened in that silence, in that place where I thought I had nothing left. Her eyes returned to the crowd. I realized that what had been taken from me was not everything I had. A quiet murmur moved through the listeners, not spoken, but felt. I still had myself. The simplicity of it struck harder than any elaborate speech could have, and that was enough to begin again. Ashley didn't speak about survival in dramatic terms. She didn't describe the cold nights, the hunger, the fear. She didn't need to, because the truth of it was already there in her presence, in her voice, in the way she stood. I found something in that cave, she continued. Not just a place to live, not just a way to survive. She paused. I found purpose. Her words settled into the air, steady and clear. Not the kind that depends on what others give you, but the kind you build yourself. Ethan watched from the side, recognizing the quiet strength in her voice. This wasn't a performance, it was a reflection. Ashley's gaze moved again, slower this time, and I found something else. She gestured lightly toward the mountain. A story that existed long before mine. People who had faced their own losses, their own struggles, and still chose to endure. The Whitaker family. Their presence lingered in her words. They reminded me that being forgotten does not mean you are without value. The statement landed deeply, because it spoke to something universal, something many people carried quietly within themselves. Ashley's expression softened slightly. I was forgotten, she said. That's true, she didn't avoid it, didn't reshape it. She accepted it. But I was not erased. The distinction was clear, powerful, final. A stillness fell over the crowd, not empty, but full of understanding, of emotion, of something that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Ashley took a slow breath. And then she said the one thing that mattered most. You don't get to choose what happens to you. Her voice remained calm, But you do get to choose what you become after. She let the words settle, didn't rush to fill the silence, because she knew that was where their meaning would take root. When she stepped back, there was no immediate applause. Not because the crowd didn't appreciate what she had said, but because something about the moment felt too real to interrupt. Then slowly it began, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, sincere. Ashley didn't react. She simply nodded once, then turned away, returning to where she belonged, not in the center of attention, but in the life she had chosen. Michael stood at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed, unspoken to. He had come without telling anyone, not to be seen, not to be acknowledged, but because he needed to hear her, to understand what he had failed to see before. Her words stayed with him, not as accusation, but as truth, and for the first time he didn't try to argue with it. Jennifer stood a few feet away, tears in her eyes, but not hidden. She didn't approach Ashley, didn't interrupt her, because she understood now that forgiveness was not something she could demand. It was something she would have to live toward, over time, through action, through change. The ceremony ended quietly. People began to disperse. Conversation started again, soft, reflective, different from before. Ashley walked toward the path leading back up the mountain. Ethan caught up with her briefly. "You changed them," he said. Ashley shook her head slightly. "No," she replied. "They'll change themselves. Or they won't." There was no judgment in her tone, only truth. Ethan smiled faintly. "That sounds like something worth writing about." Ashley glanced at him. "You already are." They walked a few steps together before parting. Ethan back towards the town, Ashley back toward the mountain, back to the cave. As she stepped inside once more, the familiar silence greeted her, not as emptiness, but as something complete, because everything that had once been taken from her had led her here, not to isolation, not to loss, but to something stronger, something unshakable. And as the light faded behind her, Ashley Smith understood one final truth they had tried to erase her. But instead, they had created someone the world would never forget.